The story of the Fitzhugh couple began in the 1960s when they got married. Christine Fitzhugh and Kenneth Carroll Fitzhugh became parents to two wonderful children, Justin and John. Family could be considered a model example of a happy marriage. On the outside, it seemed as if everything was perfect for them and their children. Against this backdrop, the events that occurred after more than 3 decades of their life together seem all the more shocking. Kenneth Fitzhugh lived with his wife Christine and their children in a house in Palo Alto, California, USA, a small town with about 65,000 inhabitants, located between San Francisco and San Jose. It was an upscale neighborhood in a small but famous and cozy town that a wealthy family could afford. Palo Alto is the unofficial capital of Silicon Valley in America. This city is the birthplace and headquarters of many famous companies, including Hewlett-Packard, Xerox, Facebook, Apple, and Tesla. Kenneth, the husband, was involved in business and made one successful real estate deal after another. In his spare time, the man worked part-time as a paralegal. His wife was a music teacher and also socially active, often volunteering in various social movements. Her husband was charismatic, friendly, and had a good sense of humor. Christine always looked beautiful, day and night, and kept fit through regular exercise. The family led an active lifestyle and loved spending weekends outdoors where they enjoyed quad biking. Their children were grown and lived separately from them. Despite their high income, they were quite modest and never refused to help their neighbors. For example, Kenneth regularly helped many people in the neighborhood by setting up and repairing computers for free. Family idyll lasted until May 5, 2000. The day began for the Fitzhughs in the usual way. Christine woke up at 6 a.m., had a cup of coffee, and at 7 a.m., she and her husband went jogging. At 7:45 a.m., they returned, showered, and got ready for work. Christine left for the music school around 10 a.m., driving her silver BMW there. The drive to work took about 10 minutes, and classes began at 10:20 a.m. The husband left the house an hour later. He had to go to a new property about 45 minutes away from the house to assess the prospects of buying it for a new client. The man spent about an hour on the property inspecting it. Around the same time, Christine went to a cafe during her lunch break after her class, where she got herself a coffee and some buns around 11:30 a.m. At 11 a.m., FedEx delivery man arrived at the husband's house with a package that Christine had previously ordered, but no one answered the door, even though Christine was supposed to be home during her lunch break to meet the delivery man. He left without waiting for a response. Christine's next class was supposed to begin at 12:50 p.m., but she didn't arrive at the school. This had never happened before. The woman was very responsible. The puzzled students contacted the school administration. The principal tried to call Christine, but she didn't answer the phone. Then, around 1 p.m., the principal called Christine's husband and informed him that his wife was absent from work. The principal was concerned because the woman had never been so absent before. The husband was also surprised to hear this because his wife hadn't planned anything at that time and shouldn't have been missing. She was in a good mood in the morning and felt fine. What could have caused her not to go to work that afternoon? The man tried calling his wife. Christine didn't answer either her landline or her cell phone. Kenneth was worried that something might have happened to her, but he had to finish an important meeting with colleagues or he could drive home to check on Christine. At that time, he was in the office with his 2 employees, helping with a real estate appraisal. After the meeting, Kenneth and his colleagues got into their car and drove home. They found Christine's car parked in front of the house, which meant she was home and hadn't left. The front door seemed to be open, which looked alarming since the family always locked their doors. The colleagues stayed outside while Kenneth went inside alone. He kept calling his wife's name and looking around, but Christine was nowhere to be found. The man quickly ran through the entire ground floor and noticed that the basement door was open. Kenneth looked in, then immediately ran outside and called his colleagues for help. All 3 ran in, and at his request, approached the staircase at the foot of which Christine Fitzhugh lay. The woman lay motionless, showing no signs of life, and it was suspected that she was either unconscious or already dead. The men in the house immediately called 911 to report the injured woman and request help. One employee and Kenneth went downstairs to check on the woman and then took turns performing CPR on her as instructed by the dispatch. They pronounced Christine Fitzhugh dead until paramedics arrived at the house around 1:40 p.m. By that time, police had already arrived and began examining the body and taking photos of the crime scene. The woman's body lay at the foot of the stairs, but had been turned over for first aid. As the three men were the last to see Christine alive, so they were immediately taken to the station for questioning. However, the husband adamantly refused to accompany the police. It took several minutes of persuasion before Kenneth agreed to testify. Nearby the body, clothes and a laundry basket were scattered, suggesting that the woman had fallen down the stairs and hit her head while bringing the laundry to the washing machine in the basement, which seemed obvious to everyone. Kenneth and two of his employees told a similar story. They came to the house after a call from the school principal and found the woman's body in the basement. Near the woman's head was a large pool of blood on the floor, and she had apparently hit her head on a large brass bell that was smeared with blood and lay literally just a few inches from her body in the basement. Several facts supported this version. The investigators found a half-eaten bun and a half-finished coffee on the dining table, a glass of water, and some other items belonging to the deceased. It looked like she had left her things for a while doing housework. From experience, however, the police know that things are not always as obvious as they seem at first glance, and that everything must be thoroughly checked. The officers spoke with Kenneth, and the man described in detail what he had done that morning until the alarm call from the school. Everything seemed fine until the police started asking further questions about the property the businessman had inspected that morning. The man was unable to answer these questions convincingly. He couldn't even name the exact address of the property the client wanted to buy, let alone describe it. He only claimed it was about 45 minutes away from the house. This seemed suspicious enough, but Kenneth looked very depressed and upset at that point. And maybe the confusion in his statement was due to the state of shock he was in. Later, when questioned again, the man changed. He began to shout, pound his fists on the table, and generally behave violently and inappropriately. When the police asked for permission to search the house to determine if the crime was related to a robbery, Kenneth initially agreed and filled out the necessary paperwork. However, before signing, the man abruptly changed his mind and refused permission, asking for time to think. He left the police station and went outside. When he returned, he changed his mind again and signed the form authorizing the officers to conduct the search. The man walked away. Later, other police officers returning from the crime scene reported finding a pair of white sneakers and blood-stained paper towels in Kenneth's car. This information alarmed the investigators. When the officers arrived to search the house, they asked the owner about the sneakers, and the deceased's husband confirmed he had them but couldn't find them in the shoe closet. One of the officers then showed photos showing the blood-stained sneakers and bloody paper towels in the car. The man immediately became nervous. He couldn't explain why his shoes looked like that or what they were doing in the car. Kenneth suggested it looked like a robbery. Perhaps the robbers wanted to steal the sneakers. But stealing bloody sneakers to bring them into the owner's car sounds absurd, unless it's a clumsy setup. A robbery was ruled out, since there were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen from the house except the sneakers. All valuables were still there. So, either the woman let her killer in voluntarily, or he was in the house before she stopped by during her lunch break and had access to the house. Doubts grew about the deceased's husband, who had no alibi at the time of Christine's death. He behaved suspiciously, and disturbing evidence was found in his car. Crime scene investigators continued to examine the crime scene for clues and discovered another oddity. A right shoe was found on the stairs. but it was on the wrong side. The police found this strange because, even if the shoe had fallen from her right foot during the fall, it should have been on the right side of the stairs, not the left. Moreover, it was in such an inconspicuous place that it couldn't have been misplaced by accident. It looked like it had been placed there for staging. The other shoe was on the floor. In the meantime, the police learned that a courier had stood in front of the house with a package around noon on that fateful day. He knocked, but no one answered the door, and he left. Courier said he hadn't heard any suspicious noises at the door. Everything was quiet and peaceful, as if no one was home, even though the woman's car was parked in the driveway. Christine thus died between 11:30 a.m. and 12:50 p.m. A few hours after the crime scene investigation, Kenneth was summoned for another interview. This time, the suspect told a new story explaining the blood on the sneakers. He justified the presence of blood on the shoes by saying that his wife had severely injured her hand in the garden a few weeks before the tragedy, when he helped her treat the wound, and that he might have stained the shoes with blood. However, Kenneth could not say how the sneakers ended up in the car, or why he had forgotten them. Regarding the bloody paper towels, he said he had wiped his hands with them, after administering first aid to his wife. They could have unknowingly ended up in the car, when the widower went to check on the dogs left in the car. Considering the circumstances and the confusion that day, he might have thrown a bloody towel into the passenger compartment and simply forgotten to throw it away later. When asked by investigators where and how exactly his wife had injured her hand in the garden so severely that she bled and stained his sneakers and the towel, the man couldn't give an answer. His new story seemed dubious. Meanwhile, the deceased's body had already been sent for autopsy. Forensic experts made some interesting observations during the examination of the body. Christine had several head injuries, 3 on the top of her head, 3 on the back of her head. Behind her right ear was a deep stab wound with a foreign object. The skull was pierced and the brain was damaged. There were traces of blows to the face and neck, and her eyes were bleeding. Defense wounds were also found on her left arm, but there were no serious cuts on the arms that Christine could have sustained in the garden. She didn't match the husband's story. The medical examiner determined that the woman's fatal injuries were a slit wound to the head combined with strangulation. Obviously, all these injuries could not have been caused by falling down the stairs, but were inflicted on her forehand. The circumstances of the case suggest that Christine was held by the throat with one hand, while being hit on the head. According to the doctors, all this is unrelated to a fall down the stairs, resembles a deliberate murder. The brutality of the injuries inflicted suggests the personal nature of the crime. The woman died in another part of the house, and later her body was dragged into the basement, where a death by accident in the form of a fall down the stairs was staged. Police, who had read the autopsy report, were puzzled by the relatively small amount of blood at the scene, given that there were several wounds on the head, and much more blood should have been present. They suspected the basement was not the crime scene, but that she had been killed elsewhere, and then her body was brought here. The investigators went back into the house to examine the entire area more thoroughly. The last time, they had only inspected the basement. This was for a good reason. Overall, the house looked clean and raised no suspicion. However, it was now examined with luminol. Luminol is a substance that reacts with blood and glows blue. It can detect traces and residues of blood in any amount, even after many years and after multiple washes. In the kitchen, the entire floor glowed, meaning this was the crime scene. Blood traces were found on the walls, proving that the woman was attacked while drinking coffee at the dining table. Some bloodstains were found in the laundry room, and all the steps of the stairs glowed with blood, supporting the theory that the woman was pushed down the stairs after the murder. Suspicion was confirmed, as a trail of tiny glowing blood droplets led down to the basement. A bloody sole print was also found that matched the shape of the bloody sneakers found in Kenneth's car. Subsequently, the house was thoroughly cleaned to remove the blood. Apparently, the perpetrator had never heard of luminol, which thwarted his plans. In the end, it looked like the man had killed his wife and dismissed the case as an accident. The police also considered other people as suspects. For example, they found out that a criminal was working on a construction site near the house. He was summoned for questioning, but it turned out he had a solid alibi. On the day of the murder, he worked with other construction workers from morning to evening on the site, and several people confirmed his alibi, including the owners of the house who watched the workers. Moreover, the investigators doubted that if it had been an outsider, such as a burglar, he would not have cleaned the whole house, and the nature of the injuries suggested that it was a personal crime committed by a standing person. There were no other suspects, and everything pointed to the widower. The police then applied for a search warrant for the husband's car, and another important piece of evidence was found under the driver's seat. It was a man's shirt with a large red stain on the chest, presumably from blood. The sneakers, paper towel, and the shirt were sent to the lab for examination, where it was found that all these items contained the blood of the deceased. After that, Kenneth, a respectable and decent family man, became the prime suspect in the case. When the police officially asked him to provide an alibi for the period from 11 a.m. to 1:30 p.m., no one could ever confirm that the man was on the mentioned property that morning. It turned out that the colleagues he worked with in the office had met him shortly before the call from the principal and couldn't provide him with a reliable alibi either. The only person who could confirm the man's alibi was a business partner. She reported that she had been on the same property that morning, but hadn't seen Kenneth there. If the suspect had been on the property, she would have confronted him on the spot, but that didn't happen, which was strange. The police were certain that the dead woman's husband had not been on the property that morning, and that he had enough time to kill his wife, clean the crime scene, stage an accident, and calmly return to the office before the school principal called. A review of the widower's mobile phone showed that he was not on the property he spoke of, was near his house. In addition, the police checked Kenneth's calls that day. It turned out that he hadn't even tried to contact his wife after the call, as he had previously claimed. Investigators believed they had gathered enough evidence to charge the widower with the murder of his own wife. On May 19, 2006, the 56-year-old Kenneth Fitzhugh was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was held without bail, and his trial began in late July 2007. By this time, the prosecution had enough evidence to determine the motive. Ironically, in such a wealthy family, it was initially about money. Just a year before the bloody events, the family had gotten into financial trouble. Due to poor business decisions, Kenneth practically had no money left in his personal accounts. He couldn't even invest as he had done a few years earlier. His wife, on the other hand, had a substantial share from the real estate deals she had previously made. She also owned a lot of jewelry and valuables, not to mention a car, and of course she had taken out a life insurance policy for a considerable sum. Later, another possible motive for the murder became known, expressed by the prosecution. The deceased's eldest son, Justin, was not Kenneth's biological son. The woman became pregnant in the 1970s through an affair. Her lover was Robert Brown, once a close friend and business partner of the family. Back then, he did joint real estate deals with him. The man later developed problems with illegal substances. Despite financial support from the couple, he couldn't overcome his addiction, and they ended their friendship and partnership because the man became unreliable and dangerous. Christine also stopped communicating with him, but by then, the woman was already pregnant and didn't inform anyone. It wasn't until the court hearing that the eldest son, Justin, learned that the man who raised him was not his biological father. During the investigation, it turned out that the lover, Robert, had re-established contact with Christine only 5 months before her murder, informing her that he had overcome his addiction, had improved, loved her, and wanted to get in touch with his son. In her correspondence with him, the woman stated that she would tell her son the truth once he finished his studies. It was scheduled for May 20, 2000. Just 2 weeks earlier, Christine was brutally murdered. Robert had a reliable alibi at the time of the tragedy. He was in another city at work. As it turned out, Kenneth also did not know that he had been raising someone else's son all these years. Christine had kept a secret from him for 20 years, and this could have been the motive. The man found out about it a few weeks before the bloody events by accident, when he found his wife's correspondence with her former lover. He was probably angry about this news. At the trial, the accused admitted that shortly before the incident, he had learned the truth about his wife's affair and her illegitimate son from that affair, which made him angry. The man felt betrayed and harbored a grudge against his wife. All these years, he had believed that the family friend Robert was unconventional, as Christine had convinced him, even during their earlier friendship. It turned out that this was only necessary so that Kenneth would allow his wife to meet with him regularly without his personal presence, and so he wouldn't be jealous of his wife. They took advantage of this opportunity. Kenneth denied he had killed his wife out of jealousy. The man claimed he had considered a divorce, but would never have resorted to such extreme measures. The investigation even included a DNA test, which confirmed that the deceased's eldest son, Justin, was indeed Robert's son. The defense argued that the police had not properly investigated the other suspect. In fact, they had not even looked for them, as if they wanted to charge and imprison the murdered woman's husband from the beginning, which the prosecution denied. Several people were considered possible suspects, such as a courier, a construction worker, and others, but they all had a solid alibi and no motive for the murder. Everything initially pointed to the husband. All the evidence, the motive, and his behavior. Many people close to the family testified in court that it was an exemplary family where the spouses loved and cared for each other. Even that morning, while jogging, they looked happy. None of them believed that the husband could have killed Christine. Colleagues who were at the house when the body was found confirmed this. They stated that the husband had selflessly tried to save his wife by giving her first aid. This was very different from the actions of a criminal who wanted his wife's death. After the hearing, the jurors began their deliberations, which lasted almost 3 days. In the end, 6 men and 6 women agreed that Kenneth Fitzhugh was guilty of second-degree murder, as there was no evidence that he had planned the crime. They saw the fact that he was not the biological father of his eldest child as the motive for the murder, and that this was the trigger for his outburst of anger. The man was sentenced to life imprisonment, which can be suspended after 15 years. At the trial, he showed no remorse, but it seemed the widower had a hard time coping with the tragedy and the lies that had come to light. Kenneth Fitzhugh ultimately spent 12 years in prison before being released in February 2020. His release was justified by the fact that the man suffered from Parkinson's disease and needed appropriate care. Moreover, at 68 years old, he posed no danger to others. Kenneth returned to Palo Alto and lived there for 8 months before he died on October 27, 2020. Kenneth was 69 years old, and until his last day, he maintained his innocence. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, and take care of yourselves. See you in the next video.
Today we report on a very convoluted crime, a case so viral that all the residents discussed it, and the controversy continues to this day. Many believe the verdict was a miscarriage of justice. The beauty of the female body can be so mesmerizing that it can completely drive you mad, but often, the more beautiful a person is on the outside, the uglier they are on the inside. Sometimes beauty conceals such horrors that you can lose not only your mind but also your life. Patrick Warren McRae realized the dream of millions of Americans to become famous and work in television. Pat, as his family and friends called him, started working at a television station and eventually became a video production coordinator. The man was hardworking and devoted all his free time to his work, which allowed him to realize his dream of a brilliant career. Despite all his professional ambitions, he was also family-oriented. He married in 1985, and a whirlwind romance developed into a shared life with children, but after 12 years his career destroyed the relationship. In 1997, the McRae family broke up. Nevertheless, Pat remained a devoted father to his 2 children from his first marriage. He maintained a warm relationship with his ex-wife Patty, allowing custody to be shared without problems or restrictions. The children visited their father almost daily, as they lived close to each other. Pat continued to work actively, but took every opportunity to see his children and spend time with them. He regularly took them to soccer games and attended their matches. On weekends, they all went to the movies and cafes together, which became their tradition. Co-parenting sometimes led to arguments between the former spouses, but even after the separation, they tried to reach an agreement and compromise. Until 1999, he continued to live in Des Moines. Patrick was 43 at the time. The father's daily routine was similar every day. He usually picked up his youngest daughter in the morning to take her to school, and then went to the studio, where he worked until the evening. Afterward, he visited his children and spent the weekends with them. However, on Saturday, October 16, 1999, everything went differently than planned. Since that morning, his ex-wife had been trying to reach him because he hadn't come to visit the children as planned over the weekend. They hadn't seen each other since Friday after the man had dropped his daughter off at school that morning. Now Pat's landline number was unavailable. He didn't call all weekend, which was uncharacteristic of him. On Monday, the man didn't come to his ex-wife's house to pick up his daughter, and he didn't appear at work either. This behavior struck her as suspicious, so the ex-wife decided to go to his home herself. The woman had a feeling something bad might have happened. When she arrived at the house, Pat's car was still in the driveway, so he must be home. The front door was locked, and no one answered her knock. To get in, the ex-wife used the spare key her husband had left for emergencies. When she opened the door, she found Patrick lying on the floor next to the front door. The man was lying in a pool of blood, apparently for several days, as a distinctive odor of decomposition already lingered in the air. Numerous blood stains were visible on the walls and floor around the body. Leading into the living room, the terrified woman immediately called the police. Police officers quickly responded to the emergency call from Patrick's home. This affluent neighborhood was known for its low crime rate, so the murder shocked the entire community. Naturally, the death of the popular television coordinator could not go unnoticed, and all local television stations reported on it that same day. But what really happened to the man? After examining the crime scene, investigators determined that the attack had begun in the living room. Patrick had tried to defend himself and made it to the hallway, but just a few meters from the front door, he lost his strength and collapsed. Patrick suffered multiple stab wounds which led to fatal bleeding. Judging by the amount of blood, he lost consciousness and died within minutes. A search of the house failed to find the murder weapon. Bloody trails were found throughout the house, leading to the bathroom. Presumably, the attacker went there after the crime to clean themselves, as the sink was still smeared with blood. From there, the perpetrator returned to the living room and then to the hallway, as if searching for something. Several items were missing from the house. In particular, the ex-wife was unable to locate a glass statue. In addition, several expensive shirts disappeared from the closet. This selection seemed odd for a robbery, especially since some more valuable items remained in place. A wallet was stolen from the back pocket of the blood-soaked jeans, but the strangest thing was that it wasn't simply stolen, but that the pocket was cut open. Why the killer took it in such an unusual way, instead of pulling it out, remained a mystery. Some items of clothing and the contents of the closets were scattered and lay on the floor, as if someone had been searching for something there. All this pointed to a possible motive for the attack being robbery, although the killer's behavior seemed very odd. He may have been under the influence of some substance, and a staged attack wasn't ruled out. No signs of forced entry were found. The windows were unbroken, and the door was locked. This was another oddity, as the bloody trail led directly through them. Apparently, Patrick himself had let the perpetrator into the house. Many items of clothing hanging in the closet were stained with blood, as if someone had searched the pockets for valuables. The footprints raised the most questions. Bloody marks were visible throughout the house and even outside. Their location and number suggested that the perpetrator had left and returned several times. But why had they done that? Some of the marks were made with fresh blood, while above them were other, equally bloody but already dried marks. According to the coroner's calculations, Pat died late Friday evening or night, about 2 days before his ex-wife found him. Police began to piece together the events and discovered that Pat McRae had spent most of the evening after work at a local strip club called the Outer Limits. When the police showed up there with his photo, many of the dancers recognized him. He was a regular, visiting the club at least once a week since his divorce. He was described as a friendly, quiet man who usually arrived around 10 p.m., but on this Friday, he showed up much earlier. He usually just had a few drinks, chatted with the women, watched the dancers, and left. But this evening was unusual from the start. Instead, Pat requested a private dance at his apartment from one of the club's employees. By a strange coincidence, this woman didn't show up for work the next day, even though she was supposed to. Her name was recorded as Laura Inland. After discovering all this, the police concluded they had a prime suspect in the murder. When they tried to locate Laura in the apartment she was renting, no one was there. The landlord said she should be there. They suspected the young woman had fled, but since there was no evidence against her, they decided not to launch a manhunt for the time being. Time passed. Since Laura could be the last person to see Patrick alive, the search for her was intensified, and friends and acquaintances were questioned. In the meantime, the detectives had finally completed all investigations at the crime scene. It was confirmed that the killer had returned to the crime scene, as the bloody remains indicated. Traces of shoes were found, confirming the killer returned several hours later, adding to the list of oddities in this case. This case was essentially similar to a robbery, but there were some completely illogical details. All fingerprints were collected and carefully analyzed. Most of them came from size 38 shoes, others from the victim's slippers. Even more time was needed to take DNA samples. About 70 different stains were collected from the house and included for analysis. The most suspicious were small drops left on the bedspread. A whole trail led from the front door and across the fabric. These traces had to be cut out of the bedspread. Analysis revealed that it was a mixture of the blood of the deceased and the suspected murderer. The second DNA sample came from a woman, which increased suspicion against the dancer Laura. The forensic examination confirmed that the cause of death was stab wounds and subsequent blood loss. Most of the stab wounds were concentrated on the victim's chest and neck area. Patrick resisted but was apparently caught off guard. As a result, the victim suffered a series of life-threatening injuries. The coroner noted numerous defensive wounds on his hands. In his opinion, this explained why not only the victim's blood, but also that of the attacker was found at the crime scene, as perpetrators often cut themselves on the blade when the hand slips during the intensive use of a knife. This should have left clear marks on the palms and fingers of the potential perpetrator. Finally, after a day, investigators managed to locate the dancer in question. According to the young woman, she hadn't shown up for work on Saturday because she had been dancing late into the night on Friday and was feeling unwell. She could not be found at her apartment because she was performing at a private party outside the city on Monday and didn't return until late that evening. The police were able to speak with her at length, but their expectations were not met from the start. The first thing that caught the investigators' attention was the lack of characteristic injuries on the woman's palms. However, that didn't mean she couldn't have been injured in other ways. She willingly cooperated with the police and voluntarily provided DNA samples, which were immediately sent for testing. While the DNA samples were being tested, Investigators arrested the young woman and questioned her extensively. She claimed that she hadn't danced for the deceased that evening. She had briefly seen him near the stage and recognized him because he was a regular customer, but that evening he hadn't shown any interest in her. She denied going to his home. According to her, she and Patrick had never met in such a situation before. She was still at the top of the list of prime suspects, but when the DNA test results came in, the profiles didn't match. Therefore, she was removed from the list. The manager of the strip club was now a suspect. Since the lie seemed strange, the police officers returned to him, and the club employee stated that he had probably been mistaken. The dancers wear different wigs, so they can look very similar, especially in dim lighting and dazzling flashlights. It was probably a different woman, but it was difficult to determine who exactly it was. For some reason, the investigators decided not to verify this information and filed this version away. In the meantime, the investigators sent the murderer's DNA sample to the police database. However, no matches could be found. Either this was a first-time crime, or the mysterious stranger had somehow managed to avoid being included in the database. The reason for this was that the information in the database was incomplete and not all of it had been uploaded. The investigators returned to re-analyze the sparse data available to them. It was obvious that Pat McRae knew the murderer, so they checked the man's immediate environment. The deceased had been a very friendly and positive person. He even had a good relationship with his ex-wife, which can sometimes be very difficult. Her DNA profile was also checked, but it did not match the blood found at the crime scene. None of Patrick's relatives or friends had the slightest idea who could have done this. It seemed as if no one had a motive to kill him. Then it was noticed that the suspected perpetrator had left bloody marks on the curtains. After the murder, she had looked out into the street, probably to make sure no one had noticed. It was possible that one of the neighbors had actually seen the woman through the window. All of these people were interviewed again, but no one could remember anything. At the time indicated, all the neighbors were asleep. No one had noticed the robbery. One strange detail haunted the investigators' two sets of clues. The first had been left with fresh blood, but a few hours later, the perpetrator returned and left more clues. This all seemed strange. When a murderer returns to the crime scene, it's usually quick, not after several hours. If the murderer had remembered a valuable item she wanted to steal, why had she left so many expensive items in the house? This all seemed like the behavior of a rash person. As a precaution, local pawn shops were checked, but this also yielded no results. The murderer seemed inexperienced in such matters, yet she still managed to evade arrest. The police checked everyone Pat had worked with and who knew him, but no DNA matches could be found. The investigators were baffled. This situation persisted for 5 years. The victim's relatives tried to help with the investigation, distributing flyers, but there were no leads. A reward was offered, but it only led to a few false leads. Investigators wasted a great deal of resources but without success. The incidents deeply shocked the local population. The brutal murder and the police's inability to find the perpetrator were deeply disturbing. Despite public pressure, the investigation made no progress. Years passed, and public interest in the murder gradually waned. Only the relatives, who wanted justice for Patrick, could not rest. 5 years later, fellow investigators from another region, their precinct in Lincoln, Nebraska, called Des Moines and reported that they might have a valuable lead in the Patrick McRae case. 200 kilometers from the victim's home, police arrested a man named Mars Davis. He was charged with possession of a large quantity of controlled substances. Facing a long prison sentence, which he naturally declined to serve, he offered a plea deal. The arrested man wanted to report on an unsolved murder in Des Moines in exchange for leniency. Mars didn't know the victim's exact name or provide a precise address, but he showed the house on a map. According to him, at the time of the murder, he was living with his girlfriend just a few kilometers from the victim's house. He knew the location of the TV presenter's house. By a strange coincidence, the description matched the crime scene. Mars stated that there were several car washes and a store nearby. Everything was correct. He also described some details of the crime that only the murderer himself or someone who knew him could know. However, the young man denied any involvement in the murder and the robbery. According to him, Mars had been in a relationship with a 24-year-old stripper named Andrea Morris 5 years earlier. He described her as a very attractive woman who had worked at the club where the murdered regular was. She was a bit odd but seemed perfectly normal, at least until Friday, October 16, 1999. The dancers' boyfriends and husbands were not allowed inside the club. Nevertheless, Mars regularly picked up his lover and drove her to work in his car. This was also the case on the evening Pat McRae was killed. As usual, he picked up Andrea, but she said she wasn't going home, but rather to a private dance at the home of a regular. She didn't name any names, but said it was a very wealthy man who worked in television. Of course, she assured him it was just dancing. She didn't do it often, and Mars pushed away unpleasant thoughts and believed her that such gigs paid well. Andrea gave him the address. Her boyfriend drove her there, and then took a stroll around town to distract himself and keep his mind off the worst. Andrea was supposed to be gone for about an hour. He returned to the TV presenter's house at the appointed time. To his surprise, he saw her covered in blood. The boyfriend was shocked by his girlfriend's appearance and asked what was wrong, to which she replied that she had simply gotten a nosebleed while dancing. Andrea attributed it all to a coincidence and asked Mars not to go into the house or to get into a fight with anyone. He immediately noticed some inconsistencies. According to him, he couldn't imagine the blood spatter coming from a broken nose, as it looked completely different. His lover's face was unharmed, and no one had hit her, but there was blood all over her clothes and even in her hair, which was unusual for such a nosebleed, even if she had been injured in a fight. Despite these oddities, she managed to persuade her boyfriend to drive her home. On the way there, Mars persisted and asked more questions. When they arrived, Andrea took a shower and saw that the soles of her shoes were also covered in blood, leaving characteristic marks. It looked frightening. Mars had new questions, including fears that the TV presenter's life might be in danger. The boyfriend tried with renewed vigor to find out what had happened in the house. He pretended to be angry and ready to go to the client's house and settle the matter. He insisted that the man had attacked and beaten his girlfriend and that the police should be called. This frightened her so much that the dancer finally talked. Andrea calmed him down and finally told him what had really happened. According to her, she had attacked the client with a knife after voices in her head had told her to do so. Andrea told the story in detail, saying that she had used the knife and stabbed the man until he collapsed limply to the ground. While the victim gasped for air, she grabbed the first thing she could find and fled as soon as Mars pulled up to the house. Andrea recounted this so calmly that he couldn't even think of an answer. It sounded so absurd that he simply believed it and then wanted to forget it all like a nightmare. In reality, the horror wasn't over yet. Andrea slept for a while, but a few hours later, she jumped up in panic when she realized she had left her purse at the crime scene. So she asked her boyfriend to drive back to Patrick McRae's house so she could get everything. As a reward, she gave him several expensive shirts, which Mars later wore. Then they drove to a car wash and washed the car thoroughly. These details finally convinced the investigators that the arrested man was telling the truth. The fact that the perpetrator had visited the crime scene twice, relatively long apart, and taken shirts with him was never mentioned publicly. Only the perpetrator himself or someone close to him could have known that. As a precaution, Mars's blood was compared with the traces found at the crime scene. The DNA didn't match. However, the likelihood of the young man's involvement remained. He could have committed a robbery or planned an attack. In any case, the man was promised lenient punishment for his confession, despite some suspicious details, such as washing the car in the middle of the night. Mars didn't know where Andrea's ex-girlfriend lived now. After these events, they soon broke up and had no further contact. The task now was to find Andrea Morris, speak with the young woman, obtain a confession, and hold her accountable for her crimes. She was put out for arrest. After breaking up with Mars, it turned out that Andrea had moved away and no longer even lived in the state. After a database check, she was quickly located. Shortly before these events, the suspect had been released from a prison in Nebraska. She had served 2 years for possession of controlled substances. Interestingly, not all U.S. states collect DNA samples and store them in a database upon inmates' release from correctional facilities. Fortunately, this was the case in Nebraska. However, the data had not yet been uploaded to the database. Therefore, Andrea's arrest in the Patrick McRae murder case was inevitable. However, this could have been delayed for years if Martez Davis had not gone public with his revelation, as the suspect was required to provide a DNA sample after her release. Now the police officers could request information from their colleagues and compare the profiles. They showed a match with the materials collected from the victim's home, which was irrefutable proof of her guilt. Andrea Morris was arrested at her apartment in Lincoln, where she was living at the time. When the police officers arrived at her door and informed her that they had come from Des Moines, Iowa, the woman immediately turned pale. They told her about Patrick, but the arrested woman denied her guilt. She insisted that Martez Davis was the murderer. The woman admitted that on the night of the murder, she had indeed gone to Pat's house after work at the strip club for a private dance. According to her, she always went to such appointments with her boyfriend, Mars Davis, who was simply in another room at the time. This was done for safety reasons. If a client got carried away or became aggressive, she could simply scream and her boyfriend would rescue her. During the private dance, Patrick pushed her onto the sofa so she couldn't get up and began kissing her. She didn't have enough strength to push the large man away, so she started screaming. Mars Davis ran out of the other room with a knife in his hand. The boyfriend saw everything, flew into a rage, stabbed the man several times, and killed him. Although the suspect tried to sound convincing, her story seemed to be a lie from the start. Size 38 shoe prints were found at the crime scene, which were the same shoes Andrea Morris was wearing. Martez Davis was a much larger man and wore shoes of a different size, and not a single similar print was found in the slain TV host's house. Even if the dancer's boyfriend had been in the house, he probably hadn't participated in the crime, as his shoes showed no traces of blood. Investigators already suspected that Mars might have been involved in the robbery or part of the conspiracy as a driver, but as the prosecutor said, a deal is a deal. In any case, Andrea was the murderer. Her arrival at the client's house resembled a premeditated crime from the very beginning. It cannot be ruled out that it was only about criminal money, but something provoked the woman. She distracted the client's attention, approached him, pulled out a knife, and stabbed him. In total, the TV presenter suffered 6 stab wounds to which he could barely react, as he was protecting himself with his hands. He tried to escape and reach the hallway, but by that time, he was already so weakened by blood loss that he could no longer defend himself and collapsed. The perpetrator took Patrick's wallet and house keys from the still, living man and fled. All this raised many questions. How comfortable was Andrea, who had stolen the keys to the crime scene, feeling? Did she intend to return? She couldn't leave the house unnoticed without outside help, so she went through the man's bedroom to see if her boyfriend had arrived. This is why bloody traces remained on the curtain. She had pushed it aside to see if the car was still there. According to the prosecution, the only true part of her story was the trip to the TV presenter's house for a private dance. Andrea confirmed that she came to her senses a few hours later and decided to check her things as she had undressed at the client's house. At that moment, the murderer realized she had left her purse behind and decided to return. Fortunately, she had her house keys with her. The dancer appeared to be acting quite sanely and aware of her actions, having previously taken care of the keys. In the fall of 2007, Andrea Morris was charged with premeditated murder. The woman refused to confess, insisting that she had not been involved in the murder. As a result, the murder weapon, which could have clarified many questions, was not found. The jury believed the prosecution's version of events. The former dancer was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The defense attempted to cite the defendant's insanity and voices in her head. It was proven that the young woman was addicted to controlled substances at the time of the attack. However, this argument sounded unconvincing given the woman's conscious actions after the attack. Furthermore, her boyfriend Mars claimed that she had been perfectly normal and did not appear incompetent. The young woman answered all questions calmly and appropriately and behaved reasonably. Interestingly, the defense attorney did not give up. He filed multiple appeals seeking a lighter sentence. In the first few years after beginning her prison sentence, Andrea filed several appeals in which she maintained her innocence. In 2013, she dropped her appeals and instead pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, malicious wounding, and first-degree theft. This reduced her sentence. Instead of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, she now faces 70 years with the possibility of parole. A motion for a new trial was filed in 2014, but the judge later denied it. Andrea remains behind bars. Thanks for watching and stay safe. On the evening of Friday in March 2012, 18-year-old Oksana Makar from the village of Luch, formerly Krasny Luch, a former military town that housed a military radar station during Soviet times, came to the center of Mykolaiv to the Rybka Cafe, bar on Dzerzhinsky Street to celebrate International Women's Day. She had been to the cafe several times before, sometimes with friends, and the barmaid recognized her. According to the bartender, Oksana drank only a can of beer and a carton of juice. Around 10:00 p.m., several young men who had also been there several times entered the cafe. They sat down at a table next to Oksana and she joined them. They offered her alcohol, which made her so drunk that she had to be escorted out of the cafe. Oksana and her mother later stated that she had been given a sleeping pill. The barmaid also reported that, according to residents of the city, a substance had been slipped into Oksana's drink, which she was unable to resist. Since Oksana was very drunk, the men offered to accompany her to the apartment of their mutual acquaintance, Maxim Przyjaźniak, a high-ranking official in Mykolaiv. Until the end of 2011, he was the director of the municipal company Teploenergo and had tried unsuccessfully for about a year to start a relationship with Oksana. In the apartment, the young woman felt very uncomfortable and fell asleep. The apartment owner and two guests, Maxim Przyjaźniak, 26, Artem Pogosyan, 26, and Yevgeny Krasnoshchik, 23, took advantage of the young woman's helplessness. However, the woman regained consciousness and desperately resisted, screaming. The neighbors heard the loud screams but did not call the police. One of the perpetrators, Krasnoshchik, began choking the woman with his hands. On March 14, 2012, a video of Krasnoshchik's interrogation was posted on YouTube, where he took the blame. He stated that Oksana fought back desperately, screamed, and flailed, saying she wouldn't calm down, so he decided to strangle her. Although he was convinced he had killed the woman, Krasnoshchik nevertheless had sexual intercourse with her. Afterward, he and Pogosyan left to find a place where they planned to take the body. When they returned, the woman was still breathing, and Krasnoshchik strangled her again, this time with a cable. They then wrapped the woman in a blanket and pillowcase, and the three of them, Krasnoshchik, Pogosyan, and Przyjaźniak, carried her to the grounds of an abandoned polyclinic construction site. Upon leaving the entrance to the building, Krasnoshchik dropped the body on the ground, but the woman didn't make a sound. At the construction site, they descended into the basement, dumped the body in a pit, set fire to the garbage around it, and left. However, Krasnoshek returned to retrieve the pillowcase. Oksana showed no signs of life. On March 21, citing information from police sources, it was revealed that the attack on Oksana Makar had been planned in advance and carefully prepared. In particular, a police source stated that Maxim Przyzhniak had unsuccessfully tried to establish a relationship with her. He was deeply hurt that she had rejected him. Despite him being such a rich and influential man, even when he offered her money for a night with him, the motive is still not entirely clear. But it is certain that he wanted revenge on her in the most cruel way possible by overpowering her with force and then killing her. Przyzhniak found Krasnoshek on social media, with whom he hatched a criminal plan. On the day of the crime, Przyzhniak didn't leave his house and made sure as many people as possible saw him to create an alibi. Krasnoshek and Pogoshian took Oksana to Przyzhniak's apartment. On the morning of March 10, 2012, Oksana Makar was discovered by a passerby and taken to the regional burn unit of the city's hospital. She had burns on approximately 55% of her body, most of which were third and fourth degree. According to the victim's mother, Tatiana Surovitska, reported on March 12, Oksana was in intensive care. Doctors initially gave her a 2% chance of survival, which later fluctuated to 50%. The doctors said they had never seen anything like this in 30 years of practice. Usually, they said, people with such burns die within 2 to 3 hours. Her mother said that Oksana had a 55% chance of burns, calling her her only child and stating she would give anything, including her skin and kidneys, just so she could live. On March 12, Oksana had her right hand amputated. A camera crew from the Russian television channel Prvy Kanal offered to fly Oksana to a Moscow clinic for treatment. However, the attending physician Vladimir Moroz stated that the patient's condition did not allow for transport to either Moscow or Kiev. By March 14, more than 150 residents of Mykolaiv donated blood for the injured woman. By March 15, Oksana Makar was in an artificial coma and was connected to a ventilator. From the first day of the incident, doctors in Mykolaiv were advised by colleagues from Kiev, including lecturer Vladimir Sigankov. Police posted a guard outside the young woman's room. The head of the Donetsk Burn Center, Emil Fistel, who arrived in Mykolaiv on March 16, decided to transfer Oksana Makar to the Donetsk Burn Center for treatment. She underwent surgery that same day and was transferred to Donetsk. On March 16, she was prepared for a skin transplant at the Donetsk Burn Center. On March 18, Oksana was diagnosed with pneumonia caused by hypothermia, as she had been lying on the street for 10 hours. On March 19, after further surgical treatment of the wounds, it became clear that Oksana's condition was very serious. On March 22, Oksana Makar underwent surgery to save her leg. Skin was transplanted from her hip to the exposed hip joint. Oksana's dead tissue was removed and replaced with gel dressings simulating human skin. On Thursday, March 29, severe pulmonary hemorrhage occurred, which, combined with severe emaciation, cerebral edema, and sepsis, led to cardiac arrest. Resuscitation efforts lasted more than 40 minutes but were unsuccessful, and at 7:30 a.m., doctors pronounced Oksana Makar dead. Oksana was buried in a white wedding dress, as is customary at the funerals of young women in Ukraine, and laid to rest in a white coffin on March 31, 2012, at the Shevchenko Village Cemetery, near the monument to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. During the funeral service, a woman in a black headscarf addressed Oksana, asking her to greet her daughter Lena in heaven, stating that her mother would never forget her, and explaining through tears that her daughter Lena was just as disfigured. She lamented that while the beasts that attacked Oksana were caught, her daughter's murderers were never found. About 500 people attended the funeral, including many children and teenagers. Buses were arranged from Mykolaiv. The funeral expenses were covered by the local government. Present were the mayor of Mykolaiv, Volodymyr Chaika, a regional representative, and the deputy governor. The governor was absent, possibly because he had clashed with the organizers of the rallies in support of her at the beginning of her treatment. The funeral was organized by people who had also organized the rally in Oksana's honor, including Yuri Krulov, the leader of the Society Against Lawlessness group, which had been founded in support of Oksana. At her mother's request, the press was denied any comment during these days, although most of the central television channels in Ukraine and Russia attended the funeral with camera crews. Ukrainian President Yanukovych sent an official message of condolence expressing his sincere condolences to the family and friends of the young woman whose life was prematurely taken by a brutal crime. Oksana Makar was born in June 1993 in the settlement of Luch-Jafanevy district in the Mykolaiv region. Oksana's family was not considered wealthy in the settlement. Oksana's mother, Tetiana Romanovna Surovitska, was, according to some reports, convicted of 3 offenses including robbery. Oksana's biological father, Sergei Igorevich Makar, from whom Tetiana separated after the birth of the child because of his jealousy and alcohol abuse, also had 3 previous convictions for theft and dealing in illegal substances. After separating from Oksana's father, Tetiana met a man from the Kherson region and moved in with him with her daughter. After Tetiana was sentenced to prison in Kherson for robbery, little Oksana was taken in by her maternal grandparents, who continued to live in the Luch settlement. There, Oksana began first grade. According to the parents of Oksana's former classmates, she searched her classmates' school bags and once stole the teacher's wallet from her bag. However, the villagers claim that Oksana was a good and kind girl, though no one took serious care of her upbringing. When the girl entered 3rd grade, her grandfather decided to send Oksana to the Shirokolinivka Special School, a boarding school, where she was admitted on May 25, 2003. According to the teachers at the boarding school, Oksana had a mild mental disability. She was not particularly good at studying but participated in artistic activities. During her stay at the boarding school, Oksana made several escape attempts but was returned each time. However, the teachers point to Oksana's impulsiveness and conflict proneness, as well as her generosity, noting she shared sweets and apples with others. After her release from prison, Oksana's mother, who had remarried and taken her husband's surname, took her daughter in. According to the deceased's grandmother, Oksana returned to school after 6th grade and still worked. Some media outlets reported that Oksana earned her living through prostitution. However, this was categorically denied by both Oksana's mother and several other sources. It was also proven in court that Oksana never engaged in prostitution. Maxim Przyushnyk was born on May 12, 1988. He was adopted by the Przyushnyk family. Lyudmila Alexandrovna, born in 1953, worked as the head of the administration in the Mykolaiv region before being dismissed and retiring in 2010, and her husband, Vladimir Petrovich Przyushnyk, born in 1952, worked as the first deputy chairman of the district council and retired in 2009. Maxim Przyushnyk was a member of the district election commission of the city of Mykolaiv for the United Center Party in the 2010 local elections. In the 2010 local elections, Przyushnyk was also a confidant of the candidate for mayor of Mykolaiv, Vitaly Voronov, the chairman of the United Center Party in Mykolaiv. Maxim Przyushnyk studied history and law at the history faculty of the Mykolaiv Pedagogical Institute in 2006. During his studies, his adoptive parents bought him an apartment in Mykolaiv. The court revealed that Przyushnyk had a relationship with a student at his institute but left her when she became pregnant. Witnesses testified that he brought Oksana to his apartment. In 2006, Maxim was appointed to a high-ranking position as director of the municipal company Teploenergo, part of the Mykolaiv city administration, and worked there until the end of 2011. The company was the main supplier of hot water to schools, hospitals, and residential buildings in Mykolaiv. Maxim Przyushnyk planned and organized the rape and murder of Oksana Makar in advance. On March 10, 2012, a passerby named Oleg Nida heard moaning. His car wouldn't start in the morning, so he decided to walk to work. He heard moaning at an abandoned construction site of a polyclinic in the center of Mykolaiv and called the police at 8:20 a.m. The police arrived literally 4 minutes later. 2 young police officers in a VL-2107. They found Oksana in a pit of burnt garbage. 4 police cars arrived within 20 minutes. However, the ambulance took 40 minutes, even though the hospital is literally next to the crime scene. The police pulled Oksana from the pit. She couldn't free herself. She got up but immediately fell back to the ground from the pain in her burned feet. She was able to speak and name the men who had tried to kill her. Reportedly, she was taken to the hospital completely naked. The attending physician, Alexander Chebotarev, said that it took a long time to lie on coals to get the burns so deep. Oksana's mother, Tetyana Surovitska, lived and worked in Kyiv for the past few years. Her mother learned that Oksana was dying on March 11 from her older sister, a doctor at the Darzhinsky Military Hospital in Mykolaiv. On March 11 at 6:00 a.m., Oksana's mother was in the hospital room with her. The police's actions during the first days of the investigation, and in particular the fact that 2 suspects were released in spite of travel bans, were heavily criticized in the Ukrainian media. According to media reports, those released in spite of travel bans were so-called majors, children of high-ranking figures. For this reason, there were widespread allegations that they might be evading their responsibilities. In particular, it was pointed out that one of the suspects, released under conditions, was the son of the former head of the district state administration, and the second was allegedly the son of a former high-ranking prosecutor's office official. However, the information about the second suspect was later refuted by the investigating authorities. In the following days and weeks, the media reported extensively on Oksana's treatment. Various versions of the crime, rallies and protests, and later on the victim's funeral. The case received widespread attention in Ukraine and beyond. In interviews, the victim's mother, Tetyana Surovitska, suggested that her connections to the media had helped publicize the case, stating that it helped that people close to her worked in television, and the events became public, so people gathered in the streets to protest. On March 12 and 13, the addresses of Pryazhnyuk, Pogosyan, and Krasnoshchak, as well as the web addresses of Pryazhnyuk and Pogosyan's VKontakte pages, were published on many internet forums. On the morning of March 13, Pryazhnyuk deleted his VKontakte page. Pogosyan's page showed that he had visited it the same day. On March 14, a website was launched in support of Oksana Makar. Numerous groups and communities were created on the social networks VKontakte and Facebook, through which rallies were organized. On March 13, Tetyana Surovitska recorded a short video message, which was posted on YouTube the same day. The mother reported that her daughter had been conscious the entire time, but that the prosecutor's office and the police had not conducted an investigation or conducted a medical examination. On March 14, a video of Krasnoshchik being interrogated by police was posted on YouTube. 2 days later, the Minister of the Interior commissioned an investigation into the reasons for the video's publication. Also on March 14, a report by Oleg Nida was posted on YouTube, describing the circumstances under which Oksana Makar had been found. On the evening of March 10, the police arrested the 3 rapists identified by Oksana. However, on the morning of March 11, 2 of them, Pryazhnyuk and Pogosyan, were released in violation of an exit ban. On March 12, information about this crime reached the Mykolaiv internet forums, where a lively discussion ensued. An initiative group was formed, which spent the entire night of March 12-13 writing posters and setting up puppets of the criminals. On the morning of March 13, several dozen residents of Mykolaiv gathered for the first rally in front of the Mykolaiv Regional Prosecutor's office. Another protest took place in Cathedral Square after the dolls were burned and the media reported on the incident. On March 13, police again arrested Pryazhnyuk and Pogosyan. They were remanded in custody. On March 15, the largest rally in support of Oksana Makar took place in Mykolaiev's Central Square. The square was packed with people. The press estimated the number of attendees at between 2,000 and 9,000. On March 15, it was announced that on March 10, 18-year-old Alexandra Popova, who had been found unconscious in the park, had been admitted to the Mykolaiv Emergency Hospital. According to the chief physician, Alexandra's condition was no better than Oksana's. At the March 15 rally in Lenin Square, calls were made to support not only Oksana but also Alexandra. On March 15, rallies against the lawlessness and in support of Oksana's city also took place in Kyiv, Odessa, and Kharkiv. On March 16, a protest in Lviv under the slogan, "Beware Majors," took place in front of the district prosecutor's office building in support of Oksana. Activists from the Femen movement also held a topless protest in front of the prosecutor general's office building on March 15, demanding the harshest punishment for the perpetrators. Oksana's tragedy was covered by many news sites around the world and by almost all major media outlets. In light of the public outcry, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych instructed Prosecutor General Viktor Shanka to conduct a full and impartial investigation into the crime. On March 13, criminal proceedings were initiated against 2 detainees under Article 152, Paragraph 3 of the Criminal Code. Criminal proceedings were initiated against the third under Article 2.9 and Article 152, Paragraph 3. That same day, the victim Oksana gave a statement to the investigator, and a forensic examination was conducted. According to her mother, Oksana remembered almost everything that had happened to her that evening. She reported that they began to gain her attention when she threatened the men with calling the police. The crime scene, Maxim Przyjaźniuk's apartment, was not examined until a week after the crime, and only then did investigators find the first physical evidence, used condoms. Since medical examination of Oksana's swabs revealed no traces of secretions, the suspect, Pogosyan, claims he did not have sexual intercourse with Oksana. On April 1, Vasily Varenik, the head of the main prosecutor's office of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, announced that the investigation into the murder of Oksana Makar had been completed, and that the detainee had been charged with 2 crimes under Part 2 of Article 115 and Part 4 of Article 152 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, which is intentional murder committed with particular cruelty, combined with ill treatment by prior agreement with a group of persons. Already after Oksana Makar's death, there were media reports that the prosecutor's office had not conducted an official identification of the persons suspected of Oksana Makar during the 20 days that Oksana was still alive after the crime, as required by Article 174 of the Criminal Procedure Code. On May 13, 2012, police took Oksana's mother, Tetiana Surovitska, under protection after receiving threats. The first court hearing took place on June 12, 2012. The indictment states in particular that the 3 defendants, aware of the irreversibility of the situation, when Oksana already had traces of strangulation and visible bruises on her body, began, with the intention of covering up the traces of the crime, pursuing the goal of killing her by burning the body in order to prevent its identification. Yevgeny Krasnoshek and Maxim Przyjaźniuk have partially admitted their guilt, while Artem Pogosyan has refused to admit his guilt. In early October 2012, the prosecutor of the chief prosecutor's office found in court that the lawyers for Oksana Makar's killers were deliberately dragging out the trial. On October 11, it was announced that the court had completed its investigation into Oksana Makar's case and scheduled closing arguments for the end of October. On November 27, 2012, the Mykolaiv Central Court found the defendants guilty on all counts and sentenced them as follows: Yevgeny Krasnoshek to life imprisonment, Maxim Przyjaźniuk to 15 years in prison, and Artem Pogosyan to 14 years in prison. However, Oksana's mother disagrees with the verdict, considering it too lenient and believing that 2 of the defendants, including Przyjaźniuk, should also receive life sentences. According to his lawyer, his client's crimes should be reclassified. In December 2012, they appealed the verdict to the Mykolaiv Regional Court of Appeal. The appeal hearing was scheduled for May 30, 2013. On that day, the Mykolaiv Regional Court of Appeal dismissed all appeals and left the verdict unchanged. Lawyers for both sides announced they would continue to appeal the verdict. On August 9, 2013, Oksana's mother, through her lawyer, filed an appeal against the verdict of the Mykolaiv Regional Court of Appeal with the Supreme Specialized Court of Civil and Criminal Cases of Ukraine, demanding that Przyjaźniuk and Pogosyan be sentenced to life imprisonment. However, in 2014, the court upheld the verdict against Przyjaźniuk and Pogosyan. The deputy head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs Investigative Department in the Mykolaiv region, militia officer Vadim Pavlenko, who had released the two murder suspects immediately after their arrest in violation of the regulations, was dismissed from his post. However, he was reinstated before the end of the trial. Human rights activist Yaroslav Dunayev stated that 2 months ago, it was loudly announced that the guilty parties had been released, and now everyone sees how much those promises are worth, as the only measure was a demotion. According to lawyer Nikolaev, the release was a public demand. The name Oksana Makar subsequently became synonymous with several similar cases. The term Oksana Makar syndrome even emerged for cases of abuse and subsequent burning. In the summer of 2013, a crime reminiscent of Oksana's tragedy was committed in the Mykolaiv region, which sparked protests throughout Ukraine. The crime in Verdievka, where 2 militants kidnapped, abused, and attempted to kill a young woman while the local authorities covered for them, was committed in the same way. Thanks for watching and take care. On December 26, 1991, 22-year-old Cindy L. Pavey, a mother of 2, was found dead in her home in the small town of Murfreesboro. It was a brutal murder. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious suspects. The children were nearby, but too young to understand anything. The investigation stalled. The case was closed, and it wasn't until 17 years later that the truth came to light. How could the killer hide for so long? Why did the evidence only surface after a decade and a half? And who was really around that night? The quiet, small town of Murfreesboro in southern Illinois is perfect for people who value the simple life. Located far from big cities like St. Louis and Memphis, it's ideal for a quiet family life. It was here, to this cozy corner, that 22-year-old Cindy Pavey and her husband Corey decided to move to start a family. But their choice was no accident. Cindy wanted to be closer to her sister, Ginger Duty, with whom she was very close. She gratefully accepted Ginger's help in raising her children, Tina and Missy. The girls were born with special needs. Tina was deaf, and Missy had developmental delays. But that was precisely why Cindy loved her children all the more. She was a wonderful mother and devoted to her daughters wholeheartedly. Although they required special care, the girls flourished under their mother's tireless nurturing. However, Cindy's marriage began to crumble. She and her husband were having problems. The young woman said they often argued. After 4 years of a strained relationship, Cindy took the children and left her husband. She moved with the girls into a house on Shoemaker Drive, 2 blocks from her sister's apartment, and began a new life there. The young single mother's life changed, and soon she met a man named Tyler Green. Her suitor's dubious past didn't stop her from considering him a good partner. Cindy dreamed of someone who would love and care for her. As the winter holidays approached, Cindy felt happy again. But a few weeks before Christmas, it became clear that Cindy's dreams would not come true. On the morning of December 22, 1991, the police received an alarming call from Cindy's neighbor, Brianna Collins. Brianna reported that something terrible was happening in her best friend's bedroom. She had come to check on Cindy and upon entering the house, found her lying dead on the floor. She then called the police. Officer Jim Butler rushed to the scene. When he arrived at Cindy's home, Paramedics were already on site. They let him into the house, and he was met with an incredible sight. Cindy's daughters seemed to have no idea that something bad had happened to their mother. The children were sitting carefree on the couch, eating porridge and watching cartoons. While the girls were busy, Brianna told Butler what had happened that morning. Apparently, Brianna often helped Cindy take the girls to school. The children hadn't arrived at the bus stop on time, and she decided to see what was going on. When no one answered the door, Brianna went inside. She told Butler that the door wasn't locked. To her surprise, the girls were watching television alone. Brianna went into the bedroom, where a horrific sight awaited her. Cindy's face was covered in blood from her forehead to her chin. She was wearing a shirt, but nothing below the waist. She was lying on her back in a pool of blood about 40 centimeters deep. Cindy had been brutally beaten and apparently raped. Officer Jim Butler had never seen anything like it. It was a gruesome sight. So gruesome that Butler suspected whoever killed Cindy had reasons for wanting her dead. But what? He looked around but could see no signs of a break-in or robbery. If it wasn't about money, why was Cindy murdered so brutally? To find out, Officer Butler contacted the homicide unit. The case was assigned to Tim Ledger. The investigation was assigned to a dedicated sergeant with 20 years of experience with the Murfreesboro Police Department. After examining Cindy Pavey's injuries, Ledger saw the harsh reality. Cindy had been brutally beaten. Her face and neck were covered in blood, and she had received several hard blows to the head. Among the other injuries was what appeared to be a bloody gunshot wound. That's how brutal the killer was. He kicked Cindy. Presumably, the killer kicked her and even stomped on her head. Everything indicated that the attacker wasn't just angry. He was furious if he had decided to do something like that. Clearly, someone was very angry with Cindy. But who and why? Hoping that DNA testing would provide answers to these questions, the detectives sent Cindy's clothing to the lab. Meanwhile, Detective Ledger searched the area around the house for clues. He examined the entire area but found nothing suspicious. When a violent crime is involved and there are no signs of a break-in, close relatives or friends are the first suspects. They can most easily gain entry to the home and are usually capable of becoming so enraged that they can cause serious injuries like Cindy's. Investigators decided to question the person who knew Cindy best, her ex-husband Corey. At the same time, the autopsy results came in, and the police had new leads. Based on the condition of the body, the coroner concluded that death had occurred around midnight and that the perpetrator had left his DNA behind. Traces of sperm were found both inside and outside Cindy's body. Forensic scientists also examined the blood-stained shirt found beneath her body. Investigators tried to find the owner of this DNA, and the first person they turned to was Cindy's ex-husband Corey. He was the prime suspect. When the question arose as to who could do such a thing, everyone assumed the husband had something to do with the murder, because they often argued. It was obvious that the marriage was not going well. The police often came to mediate the marital disputes. Although the couple had not been in contact for a year, their strained relationship had reached a critical point a few days before Cindy's death. The divorce papers had to be signed, and Cindy met with her husband a day or two before her death to discuss the reasons for the dissolution of the marriage. It is possible that Corey, upon learning that separation was inevitable, became very angry with Cindy and decided to deny her a divorce at all costs. At this time, the police received a call that could help the investigator. A man reported picking up a hitchhiker near Cindy's house on the night of the murder. The description of the hitchhiker matched the prime suspect, Cindy's husband. Investigators were told about a white man with light blonde hair. The most important clue was that the passenger was wearing hiking boots. Since a shoe print had been found on Cindy's body, investigators decided to verify this information and invited the witness to the station. Based on his description, Corey fit the suspect profile perfectly. According to the witness, the passenger was visibly nervous and sweating, even though it was December. Who was this passenger, really? Cindy's husband or a fabrication of the driver, who had heard about the murder on the news. There was only one way to find out. Investigators questioned Cindy's ex-husband to find out what he had been doing that evening. He had no alibi, and his inability to give his exact whereabouts increased the police's suspicions. Investigators still needed to determine whether he had stopped on the side of the road. They asked the witness to identify the suspect. However, the witness could not identify Cindy's ex-husband as the passenger. This suggested that Corey had nothing to do with the crime. When the shoe size didn't match the print on Cindy's body, the investigators were finally convinced that it wasn't him. There was no longer any reason to detain him. The next suspect on the list was Cindy's boyfriend, Tyler Green. He had already had trouble with the law. He was charged with resisting arrest, domestic violence, substance abuse, and intoxication. Cindy and Tyler Green had been together for 9 months, and he sometimes stayed overnight with her. As investigators discovered, Cindy and Tyler also had a strained relationship. Many said he hit her in front of other people. It's possible he had gone to Cindy's house the night of the murder and abused her hospitality to better understand the suspect's character. Investigators turned to Cindy's sister, Ginger, whom Tyler described as a bully. Now investigators had compelling reason to summon Cindy's boyfriend to the station. To find out if this man had anything to do with her death, they had to examine the reasons for their conflicts. However, Tyler Green decided to go to the police himself to discuss his relationship with Cindy. When he arrived at the station, he was very upset. Investigators suspected he was feigning unhappiness to throw them off the scent. Suspects in crimes of passion often behave this way. They even assist the investigation to prove they had absolutely nothing to do with it. Tyler failed to convince the police of his innocence. On the contrary, according to his statements, everyone was convinced he had killed Cindy. The man significantly downplayed his role in the family dispute, so the police wouldn't think he was capable of harming or even killing Cindy. Tyler explained that he and Cindy still loved each other. He then admitted to having slept with Cindy a few days before the murder, which further increased suspicion. Given that Cindy had been raped, Tyler may have been trying to cover himself in case his DNA matched the DNA the experts had found in her body. He may have been working on his alibi. He claimed to have been with Cindy on the day of the murder, but left shortly before the crime. He said his brother picked him up from Cindy's, and they drove together to Frankfurt, where he was attending a relative's birthday party. Tyler said he wasn't in the mood to celebrate. Out of jealousy, he called Cindy several times to check if she was home, but she didn't answer her phone. He was very jealous and didn't allow her to have close contact with other people. Cindy didn't answer her phone, and Tyler concluded that she had spent the night with another man. These calls from his brother's house seemed to give Tyler an alibi. He could have left the party, driven 50 kilometers, killed Cindy, and returned to call her. His brother swore that Tyler had been at the party all night, but whether that was true or not would be revealed by checking Tyler's phone. The recordings of the calls from that time proved that he was telling the truth. But even if the calls confirmed Tyler's alibi, one detail still tormented the police: the bloody shoe print found on Cindy's body. The most important thing now was to compare this print to Tyler's shoes. If the prints matched, his alibi would be invalidated. DNA, fiber, and blood cannot be replicated. The police obtained a search warrant for Tyler's shoes, but the forensic examination revealed that he had a different shoe size. Cindy's boyfriend was not involved in her brutal murder. Although Tyler was innocent, the police decided to keep him under surveillance until the results of the investigation were in. If his DNA was found at the crime scene, he could be the murderer. Some of Tyler's friends also had bad reputations, and perhaps one of them could help solve the case. During the interviews with local residents, another name came up: Arthur Hudson. When it came to alcohol and violence, Arthur was similar to Cindy's boyfriend. Friends remembered that the two often visited her. Arthur Hudson, along with Cindy's boyfriend, had been watching her, which is why everyone thought it was a contract killing. But was Tyler really so jealous that he would have hired a hitman? And was Arthur really the right person for the role? Cindy knew Arthur well. He often spent time with her friends. If he had come to her house, she would have let him in. Perhaps that was exactly what happened the night Cindy was killed. Arthur had been to Cindy's the day before the murder, so he absolutely had to be questioned. He was summoned to the police station for questioning. He confirmed that he had supposedly visited Cindy the day before her murder and vehemently protested that he had not killed her. He said he had spent the evening with friends, and his alibi was confirmed. There was no evidence against him, and the police had to release him. During the course of the investigation, a DNA sample was also taken from Arthur for comparison. Verifying the match took some time. The investigators were empty-handed, but they refused to give up. Tim Ledger worked tirelessly on the case and seemed to have found the killer. It could be a high school boy, Drake Reynolds. He was in love with Cindy and downright obsessed with her. Although Drake and Cindy had only met a few times in the past, he was constantly around her. Investigators suspected that Drake was angry because she didn't return his feelings. Drake's words, "She'll be mine and she'll come back to me," aroused their suspicions. His friends also reported that Drake had been behaving strangely shortly before Cindy's murder. At the same time, a friend of the young woman told investigators that someone had been following Cindy. He had opened the windows and cut the screen door. She feared it was Drake, but Cindy didn't file a police report. However, when investigating Tyler's involvement in the damage, the police found no evidence of Tyler's involvement. Cindy's house was fine. The windows, frames, and the grill on the door were unbroken. According to Cindy's friends, Drake had been around her all these years, and no one was surprised when he showed up at her home shortly before her murder. Friends were gathering at Cindy's house for a party. Perhaps this visit was part of a criminal plan. Perhaps Drake, intent on harming Cindy, had searched the house to plan his best way in the next day. Investigators didn't know whether he was the murderer and had to find out as the investigation progressed. At the station, Drake swore that he hadn't killed Cindy or engaged in any intimate activity with her. He even provided a DNA sample. But while investigators waited for the results of the investigation, he ended up on the list of suspects. Along with Drake, Arthur Hudson, who was helping Cindy's boyfriend watch her, was also on the list. Both were seen with Cindy a few hours before her death, but the investigator remained Tyler Green, the prime suspect. Attention was primarily focused on her boyfriend. The investigators were convinced he was the murderer, but until the DNA test results were available, Tyler was considered innocent. Unfortunately, the investigation into Cindy's murder was closed due to a lack of new information. It seemed as if the investigators had reached a dead end. There were no new information or leads. Thus, a few months after Cindy's murder, the case was filed under unsolved cases. The police were left with no choice but to test their old theories. They suspected that Cindy had been the random victim of a passing criminal. It happens that serial killers or vagrants attack people they don't know in quiet neighborhoods and then move on. Months and then years passed, but Officer Tim Ledger didn't give up hope. He couldn't shake the thought that Cindy's family deserved justice. He suspected that new DNA testing techniques could provide answers to his questions. At the investigators' initiative, Cindy's case was reopened, and the evidence was sent to a lab for DNA identification. The investigators were particularly interested in one thing: Cindy's nightgown, which contained sperm and blood. At that time, it was not yet technically possible to link DNA samples to a specific person. At that time, only the sperm samples were taken for analysis. The nightgown was not tested for DNA because, in 1991, it was not yet possible to obtain irrefutable evidence using DNA. So, 17 years after the murder, detectives tried to use modern technology to solve the old case and finally put Cindy's murderer behind bars. Perhaps this was the breakthrough the investigators and Cindy's sister had been waiting for. They enlisted the help of another crime fighter, District Attorney Mike Wepsiek. To be on the safe side, They developed a plan together, aiming to make the evidence of guilt as convincing as possible. 27 years of experience and practice told the prosecutor who might have committed the murder. Like the investigators, he suspected Cindy's boyfriend, Tyler Green. When the lab tested 2 DNA samples from the crime scene, investigators expected the name of their prime suspect to emerge. The first sample was sperm taken from Cindy's body. It was no surprise that this sperm came from Tyler. During interrogation, he had admitted to having sex with her a few days before her death. But in addition to the DNA in Cindy's body, sperm mixed with blood was also found on her nightgown. It was obvious that Tyler had covered his tracks. But things aren't always as simple as they seem. The results came in on the anniversary of Cindy's murder, and investigators were shocked. The second sample of semen belonged to Quincy Hughes. Oddly enough, this regular at police stations perfectly fit the profile of Cindy's killer. He had multiple convictions for rape, robbery, and burglary. He was capable of such a crime. He followed women to their homes and broke in. Even more suspicious was Quincy's address. The house he was living in at the time of Cindy's murder was only a block and a half from her home. Yet, no one mentioned Quincy when the police questioned neighbors throughout the investigation. There was no connection between Quincy Hughes and Cindy Pavey. None of her relatives remembered him, nor did her friends and neighbors. It seemed as if the 21-year-old man, who lived with his mother, attracted no attention. But the police discovered that he and Cindy had occasionally crossed paths as neighbors. It wasn't surprising that Quincy Hughes was serving time in a Jackson County jail for robbery. That's where the investigators visited him. During the conversation, they asked him if he knew Cindy Pavey. They showed him a photo of her, but he claimed not to know her. However, during the next interrogation, the inmate changed his story. He admitted that he knew her from school and had seen her in the neighborhood. The investigators pressed him, and Quincy admitted that he knew Cindy more than just casually. Finally, he confessed to having met her. "How many times did you sleep with her?" 3 or 4 times. What nonsense. Perhaps one of the meetings took place the night of Cindy's murder. The investigators persisted, and with each subsequent question, Quincy dug himself deeper into his own grave. "We have a dead woman." "Yes, DNA was found on her body." "Is that her DNA?" "Yes, I slept with her." According to the evidence, they were in her apartment. "I don't know what to say, guys. I'm telling the truth. I wasn't with her, got it? I wasn't there." With his contradictory statements, Quincy maneuvered himself into a trap. He denied having been with her, which was untrue, as his DNA had been found on Cindy Pavey's body, which linked him to the murder. A DNA sample is a very convincing piece of evidence, but investigators needed irrefutable proof to convict Hughes of the murder. The prosecutor dug a little deeper and found what he was looking for. Quincy Hughes had called his relatives several times, and in a conversation with his brother, he indirectly confessed to the murder of Cindy Pavey. In prison, all phone conversations are recorded. On the phone, he said, "Brother, they caught me after all." The investigators themselves couldn't have said it better. Finally, in February 2008, after a 17-year investigation, Quincy Hughes was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Cindy Lou Pavey. Quincy's arrest was a comfort to many, but Cindy's sister, Ginger, couldn't get over the shock because the murderer was their neighbor. Quincy Hughes maintains his innocence to this day, but was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Everyone was happy that the murderer was behind bars and Cindy's family had received justice. When life in Murfreesboro returned to normal, one question remained unanswered. What had happened that fateful night? Probably only Quincy and Cindy knew, but based on the evidence, the following can probably be reconstructed. Around midnight, Quincy Hughes was out looking for adventure. Cindy didn't wait for him when he broke into the house. According to one version of events, Cindy Pavey had forgotten to lock the door that evening, and Quincy Hughes broke into the house. Once inside, he pounced on Cindy and raped her. There were signs of a struggle in the bedroom. Cindy apparently fought back against her attacker, but the perpetrator overpowered her. He was certainly capable of committing such a crime. Quincy Hughes raped Cindy and crushed her skull with his shoe while her daughters slept in their beds. They never knew that their mother straightened their covers that night for the last time. Cindy's family finally received justice, something they had been denied for 17 years. But that won't heal their wounds. Now Quincy Hughes is behind bars, but he has a life. He's alive, he's breathing. He has what he took from Cindy Pavey. Thanks for watching and take care.